Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Good. Our guest for this episode is Dr. Kristen Lee, who is a recognized award winning clinician, author, and behavior science professor from Boston with more than 20 years of experience in the field. Her work has been featured on NPR and CBS radio. In this episode, we're going to explore the transformative power of agility and the necessity of unlearning entrenched beliefs in order to thrive. We will delve into the pitfalls of mindless behavior and the tools of metacognition, and from embracing diversity of thought to finding optimism in adversity. Join us on this journey of self-discovery and empowerment. We encourage you to cultivate a resilient mindset, embrace humility, and shed those outdated beliefs. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. Welcome to the program, Kristen.
Thanks, Charles. It's great to be here.
Always like to start out each episode with our listeners learning more about you, insights to your background, and really what got you interested in this work.
Sure, I'd be glad to share it. So ultimately, I've always been really curious about human behavior and what helps us to become resilient. I think that was always something on my mind, even when I was younger. I got my training in clinical social work and had the opportunity to serve in a lot of different realms, outpatient psychotherapy, and then also, helping communities to flourish. And, 14 years ago, I stepped into higher education because I really believe, in the power of education and how much it can help elevate our lives. And so I began teaching and really focusing my energy on human resilience research. I'm really interested in what helps us stay and do well, even during complex times. I'm interested in thinking strategically about the ways in which we can leverage the modern discoveries of brain science and behavior science to impact our world, so that could be within our own relationships personally, and then also our professional efficacy as well.
Love all that. We need that more than ever right now. And love to start with just you unpacking the term mentalligence. It's a great framework. So provide our listeners with some more understanding around that before we move into some of those big ideas around this concept.
Yeah, well, who doesn't love a good word fusion, right? And something that's a little bit clunky to pronounce. So, it really came about through some of the research I was doing. I was looking at high performing, high octane leaders who were really trying to find that sweet spot between striving and, high achievement and upward mobility, all while trying to preserve their sanity, right? Trying to navigate that in a way that didn't become erosive. And I got really curious because I saw, this phenomena of some people doing well with that and sort of like, setting the right boundaries and balances in their lives. And then I saw other examples in which perfectionism became erosive. So, to that end, I launched a grounded study. Now, this is kind of a classic thing. If you know me, I can tend to get overzealous. So, a grounded theory is one in which you actually come up with your own construct. It's not qualitative research, it's not quantitative research. You're actually like really going hardcore into trying to find meaning around these kinds of questions that I think are the burning questions of today's times, right? Like, how do we avoid burnout when it's being called inevitable? And how do we strive to do well without exhausting ourselves? And so Mentalligence came about. I was really looking at reframing those words, like on one hand, we hear the word mental and we think negative connotation, right? Like someone's gone mental, or we just have limiting ways in which we understand how the brain and behavior works. And then also, intelligence is a very loaded term as well, right? And how we come to think about ourselves as either smart or not, research shows happens at a very young age. And that kind of idea that coalesces becomes a matter of confirmation bias in our life. So then we say things like, well, I'm not good at math, or I'm a terrible writer, or I can't sing to save my life. And the list goes on and on. So, Mentalligence is really an extension of emotional intelligence. And, this is not to any disrespect to Daniel Goleman. because we know there's so much good material out there about emotional intelligence. But I kind of wanted to extend the theoretical understanding based on the research I was doing to say, look, it's not emotional intelligence can be criticized sometimes because it's talked about as being a little bit too American centric. It's not necessarily representative of collectivist cultures, for example. And then sometimes, some of the criticisms or concerns have been that if you're like, okay, I'm going to be this like high EQ person, I'm going to be like very all about with the finesse and the way I communicate and the way I connect with people, it can sometimes then become disingenuous or inauthentic. And so Mentalligence was a deeper framework around this to say, hey, let's make it more expansive. Let's make it more globally pertinent and inclusive. And let's also reframe some of those ideas that, are kind of like 1950s hangover-ish. Not EQ necessarily, but a lot of the stuff around what makes someone smart or not, or, like well or not. So it's really a book about unlearning those past framings and relearning new ones that help us to flourish in today's complex environments.
When you mentioned a short list of driving principles behind this thinking model, and you mentioned about 7 or 8 of them, I'd love to just touch upon 1 or 2 of them, which were somewhat surprising to me. The first one is agile beats strong. With change as life's only constant, it isn't brute force or sheer genius that's going to win, but the ability to pivot and adapt to life's twists and turns and remaining mentally intelligent.
That's right. Agility is such a key word there. So, for anyone listening and you're thinking from that strategic level, well, how do I stay agile when change is the only constant? How do I not kind of clam up or get rigid or like kind of stick to the comfort zone or what I've known to work? We really need to learn that flexibility. And so, the whole premise of this whole endeavor was really about unlearning and relearning, and that's what agility is about, not romanticizing our ideas or our beliefs or, holding on to them, clinging to them so tightly that we can't keep an open mind, an open heart, and an ability to maneuver through change in a more thoughtful manner.
When you touched upon the other one I was going to touch upon is unlearning has to happen. We need to be open to rethink and unlearn what we first believed as well. Adam Grant has a great book on that that was released, I think, at the beginning of the pandemic, but so critical for us to stay mentally strong and resilient during these times. The guiding principles of Mentalligence, we kind of touched upon those, but they help us to avoid the four most common traps, behavioral traps, which you state are shutting down, numbing out, binding up, and staying stuck. I love that terminology. How have you identified those? And perhaps you can go a little bit deeper into each one of those.
Yeah, so I think one of the key underpinnings of all of that is that we can, our brain wants to do what it wants to do, and it wants to believe what's convenient for us to believe. And so this piece about being aware, it's called being, meta aware, metacognition. And I'm not talking about the meta universe, but it's that ability to notice when we're in those behavior traps of being maybe too insular, for example. So let's say we only hang out with or correspond with people that think like us. That can be an example of something that kind of gets us stuck into either egocentric thinking, which is just believing things that kind of protect our own welfare. Sociocentric thinking is another piece that underpins this, which is to say that we believe according to groupthink, the groups we're a part of, our affiliations, our identities, our associations. And so we really have to watch out for that. We have to watch out for, you know, what we're exposing ourselves to in terms of diversity of thought, or just again, the things that have been reinforced repeatedly in our lives that could cause us then to have blind spots. So any of these trappings obviously can be very disruptive because what it can do then is prevent us from seeing in a more expansive way, one in which allows us to ideate new possibilities in our lives, and that could be like all kinds of things, right? Like how we go about our daily lives, what's renting space in our heads, the messages we're telling ourselves, how we're judging ourselves or one another. It could prevent us from taking risks. It could put us in a place in which we're making decisions based on erroneous information. And then I think, the other thing is it can disrupt the quality of our lives. When we stay with our eyes closed or we stay unaware, then we can't forge ahead with strategic change that could really improve not only the quality of our lives, but the quality of our impact in the world, which aren't really separate things. They're very influential on one another.
Well, like you mentioned, metacognition, thinking about your thinking, provides tools to counteract these very human downward spiral tendencies. How is that different from rumination? Because one has a positive connotation, the other one, rumination, you maybe probe too deeply, correct?
It's a really good way to put it, Charles, and so I kinda got obsessed when I was writing Mentalligence with spirals. Like, I got into researching the Fibonacci sequence, and any writer out there knows, like, and if you look at the footnotes and the references in Mentalligence, it was, like, hundreds and hundreds of books I read, articles, evidence-based articles, so that I could bring back like, forth, like, synthesize that with the best strategies we know. So to go back to your question, one of the ways I framed it is that we can actually have upward spirals. Like, we all know what downward spirals are like. It's kind of like, infamous, right? But we don't recognize that when we have a more disciplined mind, when we tune into what is possible and we leverage that, it really can help us build what's called a positive emotion repertoire. When you ask about rumination, you're right. It typically has kind of that negative connotation. Another way we might talk about it in behavior science is to use the word perseveration. When we perseverate on things and we have like fixated thinking. And ultimately, I think one way for us to assess if that's happening for us is to ask us, is this productive thinking? Like, am I just chewing, chewing, and chewing and there's no nutrition involved here. Am I stewing in regret, for example? Am I fixated on like, we call it mental filter on the one negative detail and not appreciating anything that is working well? And so that's the difference. I mean, I think when we think about a downward spiral, we think not only of our thoughts kind of being like mental gymnastics and then we tumble downward. I think with rumination, I think it's a lot more in the mental space. But I think when we think of downward spiral, we also see really in either case how that then can make our behavior choices compromised. When we're in that kind of space, we end up not making values aligned choices for our behavior. Like, so to color that in, if I'm in a space where I don't know, let's say I'm having a hypercritical day, the toxic inner critic's, like, telling me I'm a terrible writer, and you know me, I mean, I love writing, I write every day, it's my heart and center, but if I have one of those days where it's like, "Oh, this just sounds terrible," you're having a block, I can either what if that causes me to get stuck and then I just stop writing, I just give up on it, right? So the things that rent space in our mind's eye, we need to pay attention to so that we can offer those rebuttals that are like, "Okay, maybe your brain just needs a walk right now or some time in green space, or maybe it does suck." And like that's also okay. Like not everything you're going to produce is poetic justice. Like it's not always going to be beautiful and sacred and precious. And that's okay. Like we're not robots, we're not machines. And like we have to become more self-compassionate around these kinds of moments that we all grapple with.
Absolutely. And it also means staying on guard against these alternative truths and falsehoods that are really perpetuated by social media, politicians, social institutions. And love this phrase, and I didn't come up with it, but I love someone who said it, and I'm not sure who the source is, but we outsource our thinking to other people. And we just are not constantly vigilant or stay on guard for these alternative truths and falsehoods. So, how can we get better at identifying those and staying aware of these? Because we're very susceptible. And I would argue that the majority of us are susceptible to believing these things.
I think so, and I think one of the most important disclaimers as I wanna share with everyone is There's no shame in that. Like, we're all subject to biases and blind spots in our thinking, and no one wants to feel like they're naive or gullible, but we all have our traps. So, here's the thing. Mentalligence was put out in 2018 before the pandemic, before we see the significant socio-political polarization. Not that it didn't exist before, it always has across human annals of history. But I will declare this, that I think this sloppy thinking, I think sloppy thinking is a public health issue. We are subject to an incredible barrage of misinformation, disinformation, information overload like never before. And to that end, it's easier than ever. We all know it's easier than ever to fall for what's coming through the news cycle and through our feeds. When I wrote Mentalligence, again, pre-pandemic, and, I think what I was obsessed with was how much our mindsets affect not only our individual well-being, but our collective efficacy and well-being. And so I think we always want to think like, well, what's the strategy? Like, we all know this. I'm not like, this isn't a revelation necessarily. I might just be using dramatic language to share it, right? That it's a public health issue. But what we can do is employ what we call critical thinking skills. Now, those aren't thinking skills that scrutinize everybody else and judge everybody. Critical thinking skills are a simple way to really stop and ask ourselves, who's saying something? Is it a credible source or not? If we don't know how to find that out, like, we can unpack that too, right? We can make sure we're looking at nonpartisan sources, for example. We also can look at the fact that, like, in the 80s, for example, over 50 companies owned the media. Now we're down to probably like 5 or 6-ish. So we need to ask ourselves, who's saying something? We know that, for example, there's agendas behind it because there's a lot more money to be made on negativity than there are actual outcomes and advances that we're seeing in humanity. And you know that I wrote about this in Mentalligence. For example, I cited a source called Our World in Data. Now, Charles, I love to tell everyone, I get very impassioned about this because they compile data on human outcomes across the globe. So it could be, for example, literacy rates, it could be health, mental health, it could be, it's the full Monty, it's the full gamut. And what I love about this is it shows how much humanity is progressing and then the opportunities for humanity to progress further. So when I share this information, I always say, look, I'm not oversimplifying. I'm not minimizing the significant issues that humanity faces and has always faced. But I think it's important that we see that additional side to the story because, to your point in your question before, otherwise it can send us into these thinking traps that paralyze us and prevent us from actually figuring out what we can do to forge ahead well in our own lives, and then to use that ability, that presence of mind to then positively impact the world with our resources, with our talents, with our skills. We can optimize our talent when we're not marinating or infiltrated with like all of this. I love to use the word brouhaha. Isn't that the best word? I love it. It's noise. It's like the best word to describe what goes on is brouhaha. Use it at a party. Like, everyone should just take it and use it. You're like, all this brouhaha. People will love it. But it really, it's important that we see through it because I think most of us do, but sometimes learned helplessness sets in, or we just have so many competing priorities and burnout is ravaging through our lives. And it's a tall order to sort of like make sense of it and then kind of like swim upstream against it. But it's very freeing when we learn to recognize these things and employ these kinds of thinking skills that help us take a step back and gain perspective. Then we can be savvy in how we lead and how we show up in life.
Absolutely. And you mentioned too, having that critical thinking mindset. I like this skeptimistic mindset, which you list in the book, which is really common reasons why people believe in something. And you list five of them. And it's because I believe it, because we believe it, because I want to believe it, because I've always believed it, and it's in my selfish interest to believe it, none of which are really good reasons to believe anything. Instead, you say adopt this skeptimistic mindset that blends the traits of being a skeptic and an optimist to become a better critical thinker. So perhaps just unpack that a little bit for our audience so they can get more insights into that approach.
Well, I think the audience will love that one of my graduate students was the OG, the original. He used the word skeptimist, and I just loved it. And we were talking about like that balance in life. Like for any of us trying to maneuver, we need to be skeptical. We need to question everything. I believe so much in questioning, and I always tell those that I serve, whether I'm giving a corporate talk or I'm teaching in my classroom or I'm like coaching leaders, I always say the marker of a good inquiry is turning up with more questions than answers. So for the audience, when you hear someone say, I emphatically know everything, or I have the answer, or I have the 5-step formula, and if we just do X and Y, then we're going to boss up and everything's going to be great. I would say to that, run. Be extremely skeptical when someone seems to be very self assured, because chances are either one, they might be compensated because of their insecurities, or two, they might really truly believe that they're right. And then their opinions have solidified and those theories haven't really been tested. They might also be subject to what's known as confirmation bias, where we come up with an idea and then we only pay attention to evidence that supports that. So those are real traps, right? So I think we have to be healthy skeptics. If we're so skeptical that we become cynical, jaded, bitter, I'm not convinced that that's necessarily productive. I think there's a level with that. And there comes in the optimist part. And this is the part that I'm not a naive Pollyanna. I've been in this work for 30 years. I work with companies all around the world. You would not believe, if you could be a fly on the wall, the same themes that come up over and over and over. And so and I've worked in difficult situations. I've worked in all kinds of circumstances. So I'm not at all like a naive person or a toxically positive person. However, I am extremely heartened when we look at the new science of human flourishing, when we look at the science of resilience, for example. It reveals to us that we as a species are incredibly adaptive. We are adept at change. We are wired to continue to be able to grow, to be able to orchestrate these upward spirals that I write about. We have incredible capacity, and we all know it. We've all lived through some pretty extraordinary moments, and we know that it's pressed upon us in very difficult ways. And yet we see there are so many things that we can do and leverage. We call them protective factors. We can leverage so many resources within ourselves and in our environments to be able to continue to persevere and to adapt. And I've seen that in thousands of examples, whether in my therapy room, my consulting work, working with organizations. I've seen it in my classroom, I've seen it in my research. And for me also, as a person who struggles with sometimes unhealthy overachievement, or as a person who does a lot of work in the burnout space, I've had my own follies with this stuff. I openly share that in my public platform because this is the modern risk, is to deal with perfectionism and comparison and imposter syndrome. And so the optimist in me is grounded in the research that's coming out that shows the specific things, the habits, mindsets, and behaviors that we can employ in our lives that help us. And we see everyone has even anecdotal information. And we can look at ourselves and be proud. Even when we don't feel resilient, we can be proud of what we have been able to endure and how we're still striving to show up with integrity in this world and contribute as best as we humanly can.
Well, you're right. In all the conversations really about resilience, there's not enough talk, though, about the chaotic environment at hand. Instead, we romanticize, right, about the stories of individuals who have overcome insurmountable odds, really without looking at the bigger picture. But stability comes, you argue, which I agree with, comes when we harness empathy and community to build resilience together.
That's right. Instability is the only stable thing. I mean, we all take turns vacillating in and out of suffering, and life is really, very unpredictable and very difficult. And I think when we come to terms with that and we acknowledge the suffering, we acknowledge how difficult it is, it allows us to maybe not feel like it's a moral failing on our part. And it allows us, I think, to be freer to be strategic in how we think about what we can do to make contributions.
The last thing I wanted just to mention before we end this episode is a mindset that I hear a lot from people is that, and I love how you frame it, it's the chicken little stew. Lay off of it. The sky is not falling. There's plenty of good to be found in the world if you look for it. Doesn't mean we don't have problems. We aren't trying to be Pollyannish, but look for positive data sources and news to help balance that predominant negativity that you see in the news and other sources. Because what you mentioned in the book, and I'm reading right from the book here, here's a truth bomb that you're unlikely to hear. We live in the most peaceful, prosperous time in history with the greatest advances in democracy. Instead, we're told it's the worst time ever. The sky is falling, and no one has ever had it like this.
And we hear people lamenting all the time, right? Like, "Oh," and I hear that word unprecedented or like, "This is the worst time." And again, it's not to negate the level of suffering, so I would never minimize that. But I think it's important to look from a global perspective on how people have suffered and been able to adapt, and what we know has allowed them to do. It's not like flip a switch, pie in the sky, waving of wand. It's through conscious community. It's through candor about our true experiences in the world, and it's looking again at what is within our locus of control. How do we build that upward spiral? How do we expand our positive emotion repertoire? How do we invest in our own thinking processes so that we can be a voice for change rather than just, perpetuating the negative stuff or perpetuating things that are erroneous?
Before we end today's episode, I always like to end with a call to action. What would you recommend to our listeners that'd be the first step that they could do in building their resilience based off of some of these great ideas that you cover in your book?
Okay, so this is going to be a weird metaphor, but that's usually what academics and therapists like to do. So I would say this: try a piece of humble pie. Humble pie is delicious. And so what I mean by that is don't be afraid to be wrong. Don't be afraid to let go of cherished beliefs. Don't be afraid to have diversity of thought and expand, your repertoire of relationships and activities and things you engage with, things you read. Go beyond the bounds of what you typically do. And then if you are starting to like, "Oh, I didn't realize this," or "I learned something new," embrace that, have that humility. The humble pie is so nourishing and it's a way to grow. I think so many times we don't want to feel like we were wrong, and it's very provocative. But provoke yourself in that way because that's how you can really be a true agent of change in the world. And, by being curious in that way and open and humble, you'll learn so much more and you'll be positioned to have a greater impact. So humble pie. You can serve it with a la mode if you want.
Love that. Great advice for all listeners and leaders listening to this episode. Remind our listeners, Kristen, how they can learn more about your work and get in contact with you.
I'd love to connect with them. So they can go to my website, kristenlee.com, KristenLee. And then they can also find me on social at Dr. Chris Lee. Again, that's spelled with a K. And they can find me on LinkedIn.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.